So as I was talking about in the last section, there's a final essay exam, and if you look at the calendar again, it tells you the date that will happen. Generally, I'll give you the question 24 hours or 48 hours in advance, and you'll then have to submit a 2 to 3 page typed essay that is single-spaced. Generally, it's a reflective piece, and what I'm looking for is that you've synthesized the information that we've covered over the semester, and that you've somehow digested it, and you have applied it in your own mind. And students who have participated all the way through generally do very well on the final essay. I would say in general I'm the toughest on the reviews you turn in, and I know what your strengths and weaknesses are by the time you get to the final, and it's not the final is not a criticism of your writing style. It's whether or not you've absorbed and you have applied this information. And so that comes all to 100 points. 10 points for each review, 5 for the books, so that's 50. 10 points for the movie review, 60. 10 points for attendance, 80. 20 points for the final exam, and that comes to 100 points. And I generally don't offer extra credit, but sometimes there are extreme circumstances that you might have to face, and if that's the case, then again, please talk to me and we'll try and work something out. A little bit about myself. I've lived and worked in Europe off and on for the past 15 years. I'm a grad student here at WVU, and my specialty is European history with a particular specialty in Central European history. I speak a bit of Hungarian, and I lived in Hungary for a few years, and I lived in Estonia for a few years. I've traveled throughout this region. I've taught about European history for the last, 18 years now, I suppose. So it's something I'm very familiar with, and I think you'll find that I'm very passionate when I talk about history. And generally, most students respond well to my class. I'm a fair grader, and I usually don't try to make things more difficult than they need to be. When talking about 20th century European history, we might need to talk about what that means in terms of a time frame. And in further videos, I'll discuss some theories when it comes to 20th century European history. But one thing I want to say in the beginning here is that it's an extremely difficult century for European history. It shows the worst of humankind, and a lot of the material we have to get through in this course is disturbing. And what's so disturbing about it is that we have very well educated people in the process of murdering each other in many cases. And when we begin the century, we begin with mass production applied to the killing of humans in the trench warfare of World War I. And then we come to, World War II comes out of the mess in many ways of World War I and some of the economic crises that follow it in the following decades. And during this time period, we have the brutality and the oppression under the Soviet Union and those nations that became virtual satellite nations to the Soviet Union. So there's a lot to process. And the books we read, some of the books are quite difficult to read personal stories about these terrible times. And again, I want to help you guide you through this material. The first book is not that at all. The first book you're reading, Goodbye to All That by Robert Graves, is a very well-known autobiographical or memoir piece on the First World War and what happened before and after. And while you're reading in the beginning, you might be thinking, this book, why am I reading this book? A lot of it he details in the beginning what life was like in boarding school and such in Great Britain. And sometimes he makes very light what's happening during the war. But you got to keep in mind that that too shows insight into the nature of the mindset of the middle class in many cases in turn of the century Europe. And the way that Robert Graves tells the books tells a lot about himself and society as well. He spends a lot of time in the beginning talking about his family background. Who, does he have any famous relatives? What were his relatives? What was the background of his relatives? And this shows the very heart of England, of Great Britain, or UK at this time period, this class structure, and how everyone is so aware of their class and how they fit in or don't fit in. So that's kind of how it starts, and then you see how that kind of is broken in some ways during the war. But at the same time, we also have high-ranking officers in the middle of trench warfare with fine linens and silverware and antique lamps and things like this in the middle of the warfare. So there's all these strange contrasts during this era, and this happens really throughout 20th century Europe in many different ways. So keep that in mind when you're reading too. What is it telling you, when this person is talking about themselves, what is it telling you about what is expected in society at that time period? If you had to write your autobiography today, you think, oh, that'd be real easy, and until you have to try to put it in context of an era. If you're going to explain the first 10 years of the 21st century, somehow you have to somehow put your own life into the light of the entire era. And maybe for some of us, we would talk about 9/11 or something like this, and we'd be putting projections as to why we think certain things happen during the same time of talking about our own lives. So it's a very strange requirement for a memoirist to talk about themselves in a global time setting, in the era that they're living in. So what they choose and don't choose says a lot, and how they talk about it gives a lot of insight. And these are things too you can pick up when you're going to criticize these books. And criticism is constructive. You always find evidence. So that's something you got to keep in mind. If you feel someone is missing the point or is whitewashing something, then give evidence to the text when this person says this or that or talks about it in this way. So when you make accusations against authors, make sure that you find the evidence to support it. And that's quotes. You just pick out quotes and say, see, this is what I mean. And when you're writing the reviews, again, you need to keep this in a sophisticated light. And so this is kind of how you're going to process this. Again, 20th century European history is a difficult pill to swallow for many of us, because the value system, the level of education stuff is very similar to even modern day America, where we have where we think that we're sensible, where we think that these things don't happen, where we think this is not the normal course of events. And that's something that is reoccurrent as well in 20th century European history. The people are always shaking their head like, how is this happening to us? How could it happen to us? We're not like that. So keep that in mind too. There's maybe other lessons to be learned. And I'm not saying this in some kind of flippant way, because any full study of history will give us insight into ourselves, and how deep you want to look into that. You're looking in a bit into the human soul. And again, as you're reading these books, you're going to have a look into somebody's mind in many ways, and keep that in mind. And in the next few videos you'll be watching, I'll be talking about this in a little bit more detail, but just take it from the start that there's a lot out there, and we're going to do our best to pick and choose what I think are the most important parts, and we're going to try to study them in a sophisticated new way.